The rusted windmill creaked in the Montana wind, its once proud blades now hanging like broken arms against the vast sky. Jack Miller wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed what remained of the century-old structure. On Silver Creek Ranch, the ancient windmill, built by his great-grandfather when he first claimed this land in 1871, had stood as a silent sentinel through generations of Miller ranchers. Now it lay partially dismantled, its metal skeleton exposed to the elements for the first time in over 100 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack's weathered hands gripped the wrench tighter as he contemplated what he was about to do. At 46, his face bore the lines of a man who had spent his life working outdoors, battling both the elements and the increasingly impossible economics of maintaining a family ranch in the 21st century. The Silver Creek Ranch, once spanning 3,200 acres of prime Montana grazing land, had been in the Miller family for 4 generations. Now it teetered on the edge of foreclosure. "You sure about this, Jack?" called Miguel Sanchez, Jack's foreman and closest friend since childhood. He stood by the rented backhoe they would use to dig out the windmill's foundation once the structure was completely dismantled. The rental itself was an expense they could barely afford. "My grandfather always said this windmill was the heart of the ranch," Miguel added quietly, his eyes on the dismantled blades that now lay scattered across the dry earth like fallen leaves. Jack nodded grimly, unable to put into words the mixture of shame and desperation that had driven him to this decision. The brutal simplicity of their situation hung in the air between them. Silver Creek Ranch had exactly 68 days before Western Montana Bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. 3 consecutive years of drought had decimated his cattle herd, forcing Jack to sell at rock-bottom prices just to keep operations limping along. "No choice, Miguel," Jack finally answered, his voice rough with emotion. "That foundation's solid concrete. Salvage companies offering $800 for the rebar if we can extract it clean. That covers next week's feed delivery. Barely." What Jack didn't say was that his wife, Sarah's medical bills had been the final blow to their already precarious finances. Her diagnosis with multiple sclerosis 2 years ago had required specialized treatment that their rural insurance barely touched. Even with her income from teaching at the local elementary school, they'd fallen further behind with each specialist visit and prescription refill. The decision to demolish the historic windmill hadn't come easily. Built in 1892, it had been the ranch's primary water source until modern wells were drilled in the 1950s. Jack's grandfather, Thomas Miller, had maintained it meticulously, insisting it represented the family's resilience and self-sufficiency. Even after it stopped pumping water, it had stood as an iconic landmark, visible for miles across the rolling Montana hills, featured in countless photographs and paintings of the region. "Let's get this done," Jack said, climbing into the backhoe's cab. The rental clock was ticking, and every hour cost money they didn't have. The foundation needed to be broken apart today, with the concrete separated from the valuable steel. Reinforcement bars that could be sold for scrap. It was precise, difficult work, the kind that normally would require specialized equipment and trained operators. But Silver Creek Ranch couldn't afford such luxuries anymore. Miguel nodded and moved back as Jack started the engine. The hydraulics whined as he positioned the bucket above the exposed foundation where the windmill's tower had stood. The massive concrete base had been poured by his great-grandfather and had withstood more than a century of Montana winters. Breaking it apart would require precision to avoid damaging the valuable rebar inside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bucket's teeth bit into the weathered concrete with a sound like grinding bones. Jack winced as decades of family history crumbled under the mechanical assault. His grandfather would have been heartbroken to see this day, but sentimentality wasn't going to save the ranch. Only cash would do that, and there wasn't nearly enough of it flowing through the Miller accounts. As the backhoe tore into the foundation, the bucket suddenly caught on something solid, sending a shudder through the machine. Jack cut the engine immediately, concerned he'd hit a water line or some other infrastructure that wasn't on the property maps. The last thing they needed was an additional repair bill. "What happened?" Miguel called, approaching cautiously. Jack climbed down from the cab, frowning. "Hit something solid. Doesn't feel like rebar or a pipe." He grabbed a shovel from his truck and began clearing away the loose concrete debris, working carefully around the spot where the backhoe had stalled. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly as they worked, turning the excavation into a test of endurance. After 15 minutes of digging, Jack's shovel struck something with a dull clang that didn't sound like concrete or modern metal. He dropped to his knees, using his hands to brush away the remaining debris, revealing what appeared to be a metal plate or door embedded in the deeper portion of the foundation. "What the hell?" he muttered, clearing more material away. The metal was unlike anything he'd expected to find, not modern steel or aluminum, but something that appeared much older with a greenish patina suggesting aged brass or copper. As more of it became visible, Jack could see it wasn't just a random piece of metal, but something deliberately installed, a square access panel, approximately 2 feet across with what appeared to be a simple locking mechanism in its center. Miguel crouched beside him, his expression shifting from curiosity to cautious excitement. "That doesn't look like any part of a normal windmill foundation I've ever seen." Jack nodded slowly, his mind racing. The Silver Creek Ranch had been in his family since shortly after the Civil War, and the stories of those early years were part of their family lore. His great-great-grandfather, William Miller, had been a cavalry officer in the Union Army, returning to his home in Pennsylvania after the war. Yet within 2 years, he had somehow acquired enough capital to journey west and establish this ranch in Montana Territory, which grew into one of the most successful operations in the county. The family history had always been vague about the source of William's initial funding. Some versions claimed he'd worked as a marshal for several years, saving every penny. Others suggested he'd struck a minor silver vein while traveling through Montana Territory, hence the ranch's name. But Jack's grandfather had occasionally hinted at deeper secrets, speaking in careful terms about responsibilities that couldn't be discussed openly, and trusts that needed to be maintained. As a child, Jack had dismissed these comments as the mysterious talk of an old man with a fondness for family mythology. But now, staring at this hidden metal panel embedded in the foundation that dated back to the 1890s, those cryptic references took on new significance. "Should we open it?" Miguel asked, breaking the silence. Jack hesitated. If this was some kind of access panel to an old water system or abandoned well shaft, opening it carelessly could create new problems they couldn't afford to fix. But his instincts told him this was something altogether different, something deliberately concealed within a structure that had stood unquestioned for over a century. "Get me the toolbox from the truck," he said finally. "And the flashlight." While Miguel retrieved the tools, Jack examined the locking mechanism more closely. It wasn't a modern lock, but something that appeared handcrafted, a simple turnbolt design that had probably been state-of-the-art in the late 19th century. Decades of corrosion had seized it in place, but it remained intact, suggesting that whatever lay beneath had remained undisturbed since the foundation was poured. With Miguel's help, Jack applied penetrating oil to the mechanism and waited for it to work through the corrosion. The minutes stretched into an hour as they worked the bolt, applying gentle pressure and more lubricant until, with a sound like distant thunder, the ancient lock finally surrendered. "Here goes nothing," Jack said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He gripped the edges of the metal panel and lifted, expecting resistance. Instead, the panel rose smoothly, balanced on hidden hinges that had somehow survived decades encased in concrete. The engineering precision spoke of careful planning and significant resources. This was no improvised hiding place, but something designed for permanence. As the panel opened fully, both men stared in stunned silence at what lay revealed in the hollow space beneath. Instead of a shaft or technical access point, they found themselves looking at a carefully constructed chamber roughly 4 feet square and 3 feet deep. The space was lined with what appeared to be copper sheeting, creating a waterproof vault that had protected its contents from moisture and the elements for over a century. And those contents made Jack's breath catch in his throat. Neatly stacked inside the chamber were wooden crates, their surfaces darkened with age but still intact. Each bore stenciled markings, partially visible in the sunlight, U.S. Army, and what appeared to be inventory numbers. Between and around the crates were canvas bags with drawstrings, their fabric remarkably preserved by the dry environment of the sealed chamber. Jack reached down with trembling hands and lifted one of the smaller bags. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, the contents shifting with a distinctive sound that every human recognizes. Instinctively, the muffled chime of metal coins moving against each other. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the bag, allowing a few of its contents to spill into his palm. Gold gleamed in the harsh Montana sunlight coins that Jack immediately recognized as American, $20 gold pieces from the mid-19th century. But these weren't just any historical coins. Each bore the distinct markings of Union Army payment tokens, special mintings used to pay soldiers and purchase supplies during the Civil War when paper currency was often distrusted or devalued. "Mother of God," Miguel whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Is that what I think it is?" Jack could only nod, his mind struggling to process the implications. Union Army gold was the stuff of legends and treasure hunter fantasies. Historical records indicated that significant quantities of gold and silver had been transported throughout the northern states during the war, funding the Union's military operations. Occasionally, small caches had been discovered over the decades, usually from payroll shipments that had been lost or hidden during Confederate raids. But nothing of this magnitude had been reported in over a century. He carefully returned the coins to the bag and set it aside, then reached for one of the wooden crates. The lid was secured with simple iron nails that had fused with the wood over time. Using a pry bar from his toolbox, Jack worked carefully around the edges until the nails surrendered their grip and the lid lifted free. Inside, nestled in straw packing material that had turned to dust, lay rows of gold bars, each approximately the size of a deck of cards, and stamped with the seal of the United States Treasury. Jack lifted one with reverence, feeling its substantial weight, probably around 10 ounces. He guessed worth more than $20,000 at current gold prices. And there were dozens more visible in this crate alone, with 5 additional crates still unopened in the chamber. This has to be worth millions," Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might cause the treasure to vanish like a desert mirage. Jack set the gold bar back in its crate with the care one might show a newborn child. His mind was racing, trying to connect this discovery with what he knew of his family's history. His great-great-grandfather William had been a cavalry officer stationed in Washington during the final months of the war. Family lore had always emphasized his role in protecting supply lines and government assets. But what if that protection had included escorting portions of the Union Treasury west as the war concluded? What if he had been entrusted with securing these funds as part of the government's post-war planning? It would explain so much how a former soldier had acquired enough capital to purchase a substantial ranch in the aftermath of a devastating war, why he had built this windmill with its secret chamber, and why the family had maintained it so religiously for generations afterward. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a financial windfall. It was a historical discovery of national significance. Union Army gold had been the subject of academic debate and treasure hunter obsession for over 150 years. Museums, universities, and private collectors would be desperate to study and acquire these artifacts. The value would far exceed the simple melt price of the gold. These were cultural artifacts from a pivotal moment in American history. But as the initial shock began to fade, more practical concerns pressed into Jack's consciousness. Who legally owned this treasure? Would the government claim it as abandoned property? Would historians demand it be donated to museums? Did his discovery make Silver Creek Ranch a protected historical site, preventing him from selling it even if he wanted to? And most immediately pressing, how could he secure this find until he determined the right course of action? The remote location of the ranch had always been both a blessing and a curse. Miles from the nearest neighbor, they had privacy and security through isolation, but that same isolation made them vulnerable if word of this discovery leaked out. "Miguel," Jack said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil of his thoughts. "We need to keep this absolutely quiet until we figure out what to do. Not a word to anyone. Not your family, not at the feed store, nowhere." Miguel nodded solemnly. "You know I'd never betray your trust, Jack. Whatever you decide to do with this, I'm with you." Jack studied his friend's face, seeing the sincerity there. Miguel had been more than an employee for the past 18 years. He had been a brother in all but blood, standing with the Miller family through good times and bad. His loyalty wasn't in question, but the magnitude of this discovery would test anyone's resolve. "Help me secure this for now," Jack said. "We'll put everything back in the chamber and replace the panel. I need time to think, to research what this means legally and historically." As they carefully repacked the treasure, Jack's mind was already formulating a plan. He would need to document everything meticulously before making any announcements. He would need legal advice from someone specializing in historical artifacts and treasure law. Most importantly, he would need to understand the full historical context of how this gold had come to be hidden beneath his family's windmill. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as they secured the metal panel back in place and covered it with loose dirt. They would need to continue the demolition work as planned to avoid raising suspicions, but Jack would ensure the foundation with its secret chamber remained intact beneath a cosmetic layer of broken concrete. As they drove back toward the ranch house in silence, the implications of their discovery continued to expand in Jack's mind. This wasn't just about financial salvation for Silver Creek Ranch, though that aspect couldn't be ignored. This was about his family's legacy, about historical truth, and about honoring the past while securing the future. For generations, the Millers had been caretakers of a secret they didn't even know they possessed. Now that knowledge had passed to Jack, along with the responsibility of deciding what should be done with a treasure that belonged not just to his family but to history itself. The windmill had always been the heart of the ranch, his grandfather had insisted. Now Jack understood why. It hadn't just provided water for cattle and crops. It had stood guard over a legacy that connected his family to one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. And somehow, Jack knew that understanding that connection would be crucial to determining the right path forward, not just for his family, but for the proper stewardship of a historical treasure that had waited more than 150 years to be rediscovered. As the ranch house came into view, Jack made a silent promise to his ancestors. He would not squander this opportunity, nor would he use it merely for personal gain. Whatever decisions he made would honor the trust that had been placed in the Miller family when this treasure was first concealed beneath the Montana soil. The windmill might be dismantled, but its purpose to protect and preserve would continue through his actions in the days ahead. Jack couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw gold gleaming in the Montana sunlight, felt its weight in his hands, and wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. By dawn, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, Sarah's worried gaze following him as she prepared coffee. "You were tossing and turning all night," she said, setting a steaming mug in front of him. At 43, Sarah Miller still possessed the quiet beauty that had captivated him when they were high school sweethearts, though 2 decades of ranch life and recent health struggles had etched fine lines around her eyes. "Is it the bank? Did they call again?" Jack shook his head, struggling with whether to share the discovery. Sarah was his partner in everything. They'd faced every challenge together since their wedding day. But this secret felt dangerous, as if merely speaking it aloud might somehow expose them to risks he couldn't yet identify. "Just thinking about the Windmill demolition," he said finally, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. "Found some unusual construction in the foundation. Need to research it before we continue." Sarah studied his face with the perception that 22 years of marriage had honed. "That's not everything, is it?" Before Jack could answer, their 17-year-old daughter, Emma, rushed into the kitchen, already dressed for her summer job at the local veterinary clinic. She grabbed a piece of toast and kissed her mother's cheek. "Dad, Dr. Martinez says he can look at that sick heifer this afternoon if you can bring her in. He'll only charge for the medicine, not the visit." She delivered this small victory with the pride of someone who'd negotiated a significant concession, which in their current financial situation, it was. Jack nodded, grateful for his daughter's initiative, but painfully aware that such small economies wouldn't ultimately save the ranch. Not without the gold, and not without determining what that gold meant for their future. After Emma left and Sarah retreated to prepare for her summer school teaching session, Jack began his research in earnest. The internet yielded a wealth of information about Union Army gold, much of it speculative, contradictory, or clearly fanciful. But certain historical facts were well established. The Union Treasury had contained substantial gold reserves throughout the war, much of which had been dispersed strategically as the conflict concluded. Historians and treasure hunters had tracked portions of this gold over the decades. Some had been used for post-war reconstruction projects. Some had been allocated to Western expansion initiatives, and small caches had occasionally surfaced throughout the frontier territories. But a significant amount, estimated at several $1 million in 1865, currency had never been officially accounted for. Jack's search led him to academic papers describing Reconstruction caches, gold secured by Union officers after the war, intended to fund development projects in frontier territories as part of the nation's westward expansion strategy. As the morning progressed, Jack found himself focusing on one particular historical detail: the 7th Cavalry, an elite Union unit that had been tasked with securing government assets during the war's final phase and the early Reconstruction period. His great-great-grandfather had been an officer in this unit, and family lore had always emphasized his close relationship with General Philip Sheridan, the unit's most famous commander. What if William Miller's role in the post-war period had been more significant than family history acknowledged? What if he had been entrusted with a portion of the Union gold, with instructions to secure it in the West, where it could later fund infrastructure development in the newly organized Montana Territory? Jack's research was interrupted by the arrival of Miguel, who entered the kitchen with the cautious demeanor of a man carrying explosive information. "Jack, we have a problem," he said quietly, glancing toward the doorway to ensure they were alone. "Carlos was asking questions this morning about why we stopped the Windmill demolition." Carlos Reyes was one of their seasonal workers, reliable and hardworking, but not part of the inner circle that had kept Silver Creek Ranch operating through its recent difficulties. "What did you tell him?" Jack asked, closing his laptop. "Said we hit some old pipes we need to map before continuing, but he mentioned seeing us pull something out of the ground. I don't think he saw what it was, but he knows we found something." Jack processed this unwelcome development. Even a hint of treasure could spread through the county like wildfire, bringing amateur treasure hunters media attention, and potentially government officials before he had time to understand his legal position. "Keep him busy on the north pasture fence line today," Jack said. "I need to make some calls." After Miguel left, Jack faced the most immediate question: who could provide trustworthy expert advice about a discovery of this magnitude? He needed someone with knowledge of historical artifacts, treasure law, and the discretion to handle sensitive information. After considering his limited options, he settled on Dr. Rachel Bennett, a history professor at Montana State University who had once visited the ranch while researching a book on frontier economics. The call to Dr. Bennett was carefully worded. Jack described finding historical artifacts during the Windmill demolition that might have Union Army significance. He avoided specifics but emphasized the need for confidential consultation, offering to pay for her time and expertise. To his relief, Dr. Bennett remembered Silver Creek Ranch and agreed to drive out the following day, suggesting they meet privately before involving any other authorities. Her caution matched Jack's own instincts. Historical discoveries of this nature could become complicated quickly, with multiple parties asserting claims. The remainder of the day passed in a fog of anticipation and anxiety. Jack went through the motions of ranch work, checking cattle in the north pasture and repairing equipment in the barn, but his mind remained fixed on the hidden chamber and its implications for his family's future. That evening, after a quiet dinner during which Sarah cast increasingly concerned glances his way, Jack finally made the decision to confide in his wife. They sat on the porch swing as twilight settled over the ranch, the distant mountains turning purple against the fading light. "There's something I need to show you," he said, taking her hand. "Something that might change everything for us." Sarah listened without interruption as Jack described the hidden chamber and its contents. When he finished, she remained silent for several long moments, processing the magnitude of what he'd told her. "So all this time," she said finally, "while we've been fighting to save the ranch, worrying about medical bills and bank loans, there was a fortune buried under that old windmill." Jack nodded. "Apparently my great-great-grandfather had secrets that died with him. The question now is what we do with those secrets." Sarah's practical nature asserted itself immediately. "What are the legal implications? Does finding treasure on your own property make it yours? That's why Dr. Bennett is coming tomorrow. The laws around treasure troves are complicated, especially when they might have historical significance. And this isn't just any historical gold. It's Union Army gold, which carries all kinds of additional complications." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "But Jack," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "be prepared for this to become bigger than just us. Something like this doesn't stay secret for long." Her words proved prophetic sooner than either could have anticipated. The following morning, Jack looked up from his coffee to see a dust cloud approaching along the ranch road. Not the single vehicle he expected from Dr. Bennett, but 3 vehicles moving with purpose toward the house. The led vehicle was a county sheriff's cruiser, followed by an unmarked sedan and a pickup truck with the logo of the Montana Historical Society emblazoned on its door. Jack felt his stomach tighten as they pulled into the yard. Sheriff Tom McKenzie emerged from the cruiser with the weary expression of a man performing an unwelcome duty. Behind him, a tall woman in her 50s exited the sedan while 2 men in casual business attire stepped from the Historical Society truck. "Morning, Jack," the sheriff said, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Got a situation we need to discuss." Jack nodded to Sarah, who retreated inside, understanding the need to prepare for whatever was coming. He stepped down to meet the visitors, maintaining a neutral expression despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "What can I help you with, Tom?" The sheriff gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Agent Diane Foster with the FBI Art Crimes Division. These gentlemen are from the Historical Society. They'd like to ask you some questions about an archaeological find on your property." Agent Foster stepped forward, offering her credentials for inspection. "Mr. Miller, we've received information that you may have uncovered artifacts of historical significance during your windmill demolition. We'd like to discuss the proper procedures for documenting and preserving such finds." Jack kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. How had they learned about the discovery so quickly? The only people who knew were Sarah, Miguel, and possibly Carlos if he'd seen more than he let on. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Jack said carefully. "We're dismantling an old windmill structure, yes, but we haven't completed the excavation of the foundation yet." Agent Foster's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Miller, we have reason to believe you've uncovered a cache of Civil War-era artifacts, possibly including currency or precious metals. Federal law requires such discoveries to be properly documented, particularly when they may constitute protected historical resources." Before Jack could respond, Dr. Rachel Bennett's SUV pulled into the yard. She emerged looking confused at the gathering of official vehicles, but approached with professional composure. "Dr. Bennett," Jack called out, relieved to see a potential ally. "Thank you for coming. It seems we have several parties interested in the historical aspects of the ranch today." Recognition flashed across Agent Foster's face. "Dr. Bennett, I wasn't aware you were consulting on this matter. I received a call from Mr. Miller yesterday about potential historical artifacts," Dr. Bennett replied carefully. "I agreed to provide an initial assessment before any formal processes were initiated." The tension in the yard was palpable as the various parties sized each other up. Jack realized he was witnessing the first skirmish in what could become a complex battle over the treasure, a battle he wasn't prepared to fight without understanding the legal landscape. "Perhaps we should all sit down," he suggested, gesturing toward the porch. "I'm happy to cooperate with proper authorities, but I'd like to understand exactly what's being alleged and what my rights are as the property owner." The next 2 hours unfolded in a tense discussion around the porch table. Agent Foster explained that an anonymous tip had alerted authorities to a potential discovery of Union artifacts on the Miller property. Under various federal and state laws, such discoveries needed to be reported and properly documented, particularly when they might constitute cultural heritage items. Dr. Bennett, proving her worth immediately, outlined the complex legal framework surrounding such finds, from the Archaeological Resources Protection Act to Montana state laws on treasure troves and abandoned property. The Historical Society representatives emphasized the scholarly importance of preserving any Civil War artifacts in their historical context. Throughout the discussion, Jack carefully avoided confirming or denying the specific nature of what they had found. He acknowledged uncovering unusual structural elements during the windmill demolition, but insisted that proper evaluation by experts like Dr. Bennett was his next intended step. "I understand everyone's concerns," Jack said finally, "but this is private property that's been in my family for over 150 years. Whatever historical significance this ranch might have, I need to understand my rights before proceeding further." Agent Foster's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Miller, I should make it clear that concealing or attempting to sell historically significant artifacts, particularly those that might constitute federal property, could have serious legal consequences. Are you suggesting that anything found on my ranch automatically belongs to the government?" Jack asked, feeling his temper rise despite his efforts to remain diplomatic. Dr. Bennett intervened smoothly. "I think what Agent Foster is trying to explain is that the legal status of certain historical items can be complex. Union government property in particular exists in a unique legal category because of how the Civil War and Reconstruction unfolded." Sheriff Mackenzie, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke up. "Look, Jack's a respected member of this community. His family has owned this land since before any of our current laws were written. Seems to me he deserves the courtesy of proper legal consultation before we start making claims on whatever he might have found." The standoff eventually resolved into an uneasy compromise. Jack agreed to allow Dr. Bennett to conduct a preliminary assessment of the site, with the understanding that she would document any findings according to proper archaeological standards. Agent Foster would return the following day with the appropriate paperwork for a formal investigation, and no excavation would proceed until all parties had clarified their positions. As the vehicles departed, leaving only Dr. Bennett's SUV in the yard, Jack felt the weight of what was happening settling on his shoulders. The simple act of demolishing an old windmill had unleashed forces beyond his control: government agencies, historical societies, and likely more parties yet to come, all converging on his struggling ranch with competing claims and agendas. That could have gone worse, Dr. Bennett observed as they watched the dust cloud recede down the ranch road. How did they find out so quickly? Jack asked, still puzzled by the timing. Dr. Bennett shrugged. Rural communities have few secrets. But there's something else to consider. The FBI doesn't typically respond so rapidly to vague reports of historical finds, unless they have specific interest in the item. I suspect they've been monitoring for reports of Union gold for a very long time. This observation sent a chill through Jack. Had his family been sitting on a secret that others had been actively searching for? Had his great-grandfather William been more than just a returning Union soldier who built a successful ranch? Dr. Bennett, before we look at the site, I need to know, legally speaking, where do I stand? If this is truly Union Treasury gold, who owns it? The historian's expression grew thoughtful. That's an extraordinarily complex question. Union government property technically remains United States property, which is likely the basis for the FBI's interest. However, property that was hidden or abandoned for over 150 years, on private land continuously owned by the same family, creates a compelling counter-argument. She continued, there's also the matter of historical versus monetary value. These items are potentially priceless historical artifacts, which creates a public interest in their preservation. But that doesn't automatically negate your rights as the property owner and discoverer. Jack absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility growing heavier. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about history, legacy, and doing right by both his ancestors and future generations. What would you do in my position? He asked finally. Dr. Bennett smiled slightly. I'm a historian, Mr. Miller. My instinct is always to preserve the historical record above all else. But I also believe that history belongs to the families who lived it, not just to institutions and governments. She gathered her notebook and pen. Now, perhaps you should show me exactly what we're dealing with so I can help you navigate what comes next. As they walked toward the windmill site, Jack felt a curious sense of relief. The secret was out, at least partially, and now the path forward would involve not just his decisions, but the complex intersection of law, history, and competing interests. Whatever happened next, Silver Creek Ranch had already reclaimed its place in history, not just as a struggling cattle operation, but as the keeper of secrets that connected his family to the tumultuous birth of the American West. The Windmill Foundation, partially excavated, but with its crucial secrets still hidden beneath hastily replaced dirt, awaited them. Jack realized that whatever treasure lay beneath was already transforming his understanding of his family's past and would inevitably reshape its future in ways he could barely begin to imagine. The sun hung low in the Montana sky as Jack led Dr. Bennett to the Windmill Foundation. The historian's practiced eyes surveyed the excavation site with professional interest, but Jack could see the moment when academic curiosity gave way to genuine excitement as he revealed the metal panel embedded in the concrete. "This is remarkable," she murmured, crouching beside the hidden door. "The craftsmanship alone suggests this wasn't improvised. Someone designed this chamber with permanence in mind." Jack nodded, recalling his similar observation. "My great-great-grandfather wasn't just hiding something temporarily. He was creating a time capsule meant to last generations. Under Dr. Bennett's guidance, they carefully reopened the chamber. Despite having seen the contents before, Jack felt a renewed sense of awe as the gold gleamed in the afternoon light. Dr. Bennett's reaction was everything he might have expected from a historian encountering a legendary treasure professional. Composure battling childlike wonder. "These aren't just Union Treasury bars," she said, examining one of the gold ingots with gloved hands. "These are from the San Francisco Mint. The markings indicate they were cast in 1864, during the height of the war. This is unprecedented. Most Union gold was recirculated after the war to fund Reconstruction and westward expansion. To find original mint bars preserved in their original state, this is beyond significant." As Dr. Bennett carefully documented each item, photographing and recording detailed descriptions, Jack found himself thinking less about the gold's monetary value and more about the extraordinary circumstances that had brought it to his family's land. What kind of man had his great-great-grandfather been to bear such responsibility, to safeguard this wealth through the dangerous frontier years, when law was tenuous and temptation must have been overwhelming? "There's something else here," Dr. Bennett said suddenly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She had shifted several crates and was examining what appeared to be a leather document case tucked against the far wall of the chamber. Unlike the gold, which had been meticulously organized in crates and bags, this case seemed to have been placed separately, perhaps as an afterthought. The leather had hardened with age but remained remarkably intact, preserved by the chamber's controlled environment. A simple brass clasp held it closed, the metal dark with tarnish but unbroken. Dr. Bennett looked to Jack, silently asking permission to proceed. "Go ahead," he said, his curiosity overcoming any reservations. With careful movements, she released the clasp and opened the case. Inside lay a stack of documents, handwritten letters, official-looking papers with faded seals, and a bound journal. The topmost document bore the letterhead of the United States Treasury Department and was dated April 18, 1865, just days after Lincoln's assassination and the war's conclusion. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Bennett whispered, her academic detachment momentarily forgotten. "This appears to be an official transfer order, authorizing Lieutenant William Miller to transport Treasury assets westward for safekeeping during the uncertain transition of power following President Lincoln's death." Jack leaned closer, struggling to decipher the elaborate handwriting. "Does it say why him? Why was my great-great-grandfather chosen for this mission?" Dr. Bennett scanned the document. It references his unwavering loyalty to the Union and demonstrated discretion in matters of financial transport. But there's something else. She carefully turned to the second page. It mentions that he's being entrusted with these specific assets because of his familial connections in the Western Territories and established roots beyond Confederate sympathizer surveillance. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Jack family. History had always mentioned that William's cousin had journeyed to Montana Territory before the war, establishing a small trading post near what was now Bozeman. That connection would have provided a legitimate reason for his travel west and a safe haven once he arrived. The journal proved even more revealing. Written in William Miller's neat, disciplined hand, it chronicled his journey from Washington to Montana Territory in the chaotic final days of the Civil War. The early entries described the desperate efforts to secure government assets during the period of national mourning and political uncertainty following Lincoln's assassination, with William assigned to one of several teams charged with moving different portions of the Union gold reserves to secure locations. "Listen to this," Dr. Bennett said, reading aloud from an entry dated April 25, 1865. "Washington remains in chaos. President Johnson lacks the confidence of many, and fears of further violence persist. Our orders remain clear: move westward, avoid areas of Confederate sympathy, and preserve these assets for the rebuilding of our nation. The men know nothing of our cargo, believing we transport only military documents. This deception is necessary, but weighs heavily upon my conscience. The journal detailed a harrowing journey across a nation still reeling from 4 years of brutal conflict. William's small escort of trusted soldiers had traveled by train when possible, by horseback when necessary, maintaining constant vigilance against potential threats. Most of his escort had eventually been dismissed as they traveled deeper into Western territories where Union presence was firmly established. A June entry described William's decision as news of Reconstruction policies began to emerge. The nation's healing will be long and difficult. I am resolved that these resources shall not be diverted to political purposes or fall into the hands of those who would misuse them. They shall be preserved for a day when they might truly serve the frontier development that Mr. Lincoln so fervently believed would unite our wounded country. Dr. Bennett looked up from the journal. He wasn't planning to use this gold as originally instructed. He was preserving it almost as if he foresaw a time when its use could be uncorrupted by the politics of Reconstruction. Further entries chronicled William's arrival in Montana Territory, his reunion with his cousin's family, and his careful considerations about how to secure the gold for the long term. The Windmill and its hidden chamber had been constructed over several months in late 1871. Designed with the help of a German engineer who had immigrated to Montana before the war and who asked no questions about the purpose of such unusual construction. The final entries revealed William's ethical struggle with his role as guardian of Union wealth. He had clearly believed he was acting honorably by protecting these assets from potential misuse. Yet, he had also recognized that his actions could be viewed as a betrayal of his orders. Jack was particularly struck by the last entry, dated December 1893, written when William was an old man. Shortly after the windmill's completion, I have carried this burden for nearly 30 years. I took an oath to protect these assets, and that oath did not expire with the surrender at Appomattox. But I have come to understand that they belong not to any government of the day, but to the future of this frontier. They are a promise of what America might become when the wounds of division have truly healed. I leave them here beneath this windmill that gives life to my ranch, and I entrust to my descendants the wisdom to know when and how they should return to the light. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the excavation site, Jack and Dr. Bennett carefully replaced the documents and resealed the chamber. They would need proper archival materials and better lighting to continue the documentation process. More urgently, they needed to prepare for tomorrow's confrontation with the FBI and other interested parties. "What do you think happens now?" Jack asked as they walked back toward the ranch house, the weight of his ancestors' words heavy in his thoughts. Dr. Bennett considered the question carefully. Legally, this is uncharted territory. The government will certainly claim these assets based on their origin as Union property, but your family's continuous possession, combined with the clear documentation of William's intentions, creates a compelling counterargument. She continued, "From a historical perspective, this is perhaps the most significant Civil War financial discovery in over a century. Museums will want it preserved intact. Collectors would pay astronomical sums for individual pieces. Academics will want access for research." "And what about Silver Creek Ranch?" Jack asked, voicing his most immediate concern. "What about my family's future?" Dr. Bennett's expression softened. "That's where you have leverage, Mr. Miller. This discovery happened on your land, preserved by your family for generations. Whatever legal claims might exist, you have both moral standing and practical control. No one can access this treasure without your cooperation." The evening brought a flurry of activity to the normally quiet ranch. Jack called a family meeting, sharing the full details of the discovery with Sarah, Emma, and his 19-year-old son, Tyler, who was home from college for the summer. Their reactions ranged from incredulous to cautiously excited, but all understood the gravity of what had been uncovered. "Does this mean we can save the ranch?" Tyler asked, always the practical one. It's not that simple, Jack explained. This isn't just buried treasure we can cash in. It's historical artifacts with complex legal status. But yes, I believe it changes our situation fundamentally. Sarah, who had been quietly processing everything, finally spoke. William preserved this treasure through the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He could have used it for himself, could have disappeared with a fortune. Instead, he protected it for future generations for a purpose he couldn't fully envision. Her words resonated with Jack. William hadn't just been following orders or protecting Union assets. He had been preserving history, creating a legacy that transcended the politics and conflicts of his time. Miguel joined them later that evening, bringing the troubling news that word of the discovery had spread through the local community. People are saying all kinds of things, he reported. That you found Union gold, Confederate gold, Spanish doubloons. Every version gets wilder. Carlos's cousin works at the diner in town, and she says it's all anyone's talking about. Jack wasn't surprised. In a small Montana community, news, especially extraordinary news, traveled at the speed of conversation. By morning, they could expect curiosity seekers and possibly even treasure hunters testing the boundaries of the property. We need security, he decided. Tyler, call your friends from the rodeo team. See who can come out tonight to help patrol the perimeter. We'll pay them what we can. It wasn't much, but the young cowboys who competed with Tyler were loyal and capable, and most owned rifles for hunting. By midnight, a makeshift security detail of 6 young men in pickup trucks was patrolling the ranch boundaries. Dr. Bennett had departed with promises to return early the next morning, armed with legal resources and academic contacts who might help navigate the coming storm. Jack spent the night in his office reviewing every document related to the ranch's history that he could find: property deeds, family letters, photographs, anything that might strengthen their position in the inevitable negotiations ahead. Sarah joined him after midnight, bringing coffee and her steady presence. What would William want us to do? She asked, sitting across from him. If he preserved this treasure for future generations, what purpose would he want it to serve now? The question struck at the heart of Jack's dilemma. The gold represented immediate financial salvation for the struggling ranch if they could establish legal ownership. But William's journal suggested he had seen beyond immediate needs to some greater historical purpose. I think he would want us to honor both the past and the future, Jack said finally. To respect the history this treasure represents, but also to ensure it serves the living as well as the dead. Morning brought the expected convoy of vehicles, more this time, and more official. Agent Foster returned with additional FBI personnel, accompanied by representatives from the Montana Historical Commission, the Smithsonian Institution, and what appeared to be Justice Department attorneys. Sheriff Mackenzie arrived separately, positioning himself ambiguously between the government contingent and the Miller family. The meeting convened in the ranch's largest space, the converted barn that had once housed hay and equipment, but now served as an event venue for the occasional wedding or community gathering that brought supplemental income to the struggling operation. Jack had decided to control the narrative by presenting a united front. The entire Miller family was present, along with Dr. Bennett, Miguel, and the ranch's longtime attorney, James Whitaker, hastily summoned from Helena. Agent Foster opened the proceedings with the expected government position. Based on preliminary information, we believe the artifacts discovered on this property constitute Union Treasury assets that legally remain U.S. government property. We're prepared to secure the site and begin a formal excavation and recovery operation. One of the Justice Department attorneys elaborated on the legal framework, citing historical precedents and federal statutes regarding abandoned government property and cultural artifacts of national significance. His argument was polished and clearly prepared for this specific scenario, suggesting that the FBI had indeed been monitoring for such discoveries for decades. When they finished, Jack nodded to Attorney Whitaker, who rose with the confident demeanor of a man who had spent 40 years defending ranching families against corporate interests and government overreach. "My client acknowledges the historical significance of this discovery," Whitaker began, "but categorically rejects the government's claim of automatic ownership. The Miller family has maintained continuous possession of this property since 1868. The artifacts in question were deliberately placed in a secure chamber constructed specifically for their preservation, not abandoned or discarded." He continued, holding up copies of the journal entries they had discovered. "Furthermore, we have contemporaneous documentation indicating that Lieutenant William Miller, while initially acting under Union authority, made a conscious decision after the war to preserve these assets as historical artifacts rather than as government property. His intent, clearly stated, was to safeguard them for future generations, which he has successfully done through his descendants." The debate that followed was intense but surprisingly respectful. The Smithsonian representative, Dr. Howard Jenkins, seemed less concerned with ownership than with preservation. "Whatever the legal resolution," he emphasized, "these artifacts represent an unprecedented historical resource. They must be properly conserved, studied, and ultimately made accessible to scholars and the public." Dr. Bennett supported this position, arguing that the historical significance transcended questions of legal ownership. "This is perhaps the most complete and well-documented Union Treasury collection in existence. Its value lies not just in the gold itself, but in the intact nature of the cash and the accompanying documentation." As the morning stretched into afternoon, the discussion evolved from confrontational to collaborative. Jack, listening more than speaking, began to see a path forward that might honor William's intentions while securing his family's future. When he finally rose to address the gathering, the room fell silent. "My great-great-grandfather preserved this treasure through the most traumatic period in our nation's history, a perilous journey across a wounded country, and the challenges of building a new life on the Montana frontier. He could have used it for personal gain, but chose instead to protect it for a purpose he couldn't fully define." Jack gestured to his family, Sarah, Tyler, and Emma, who stood with him. "5 generations of Millers have been unwitting guardians of this history. Now that it's come to light, we intend to honor that responsibility." He outlined a surprising proposal that had formed in his mind during the long discussions. The Miller family would donate the majority of the artifacts to a new museum to be constructed on a portion of the ranch property. This museum, operated in partnership with the Smithsonian and the Montana Historical Commission, would preserve and display the Union Treasury collection in its historical context, along with exhibits about the Civil War's economic dimensions and William Miller's extraordinary journey. In exchange, the family would retain ownership of a small portion of the gold enough to secure the ranch's financial future and establish an endowment for the museum's ongoing operation. Silver Creek Ranch would continue as a working cattle operation, with portions open to visitors interested in experiencing authentic Montana ranching traditions alongside the historical exhibits. "William preserved this treasure during one of our nation's darkest chapters," Jack concluded. "He did so not to circumvent government authority, but to serve some future purpose he couldn't fully imagine. I believe this is that purpose, to transform what began as the wealth of a nation at war with itself into a resource for education, preservation, and reconciliation." The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Jenkins from the Smithsonian. "Speaking unofficially," he said, "this proposal represents exactly the kind of public-private partnership our institution values. It preserves the historical context, provides public access, and respects the family's extraordinary role in this discovery." Even Agent Foster seemed receptive, though she emphasized that formal approvals would require extensive consultation with various government agencies. "But I can say that your approach aligns with our primary concern, ensuring these artifacts are properly preserved and their historical significance respected. By day's end, a framework agreement had been drafted. The details would require months of negotiation, but the core principles were established: preservation, education, and a balanced recognition of both public and private interests in this extraordinary historical discovery. As the officials departed, promising to return with formal proposals, Jack stood with his family on the porch of the ranch house that had sheltered Millers for over a century. The setting sun cast golden light across the pastures where cattle still grazed, the barn where generations had worked, and the distant windmill site that had revealed its long-kept secret. "Do you think William would approve?" Sarah asked, slipping her hand into his. Jack nodded slowly. "I think he preserved this treasure not just from something, but for something." He couldn't know what challenges his descendants would face or what purpose the gold might ultimately serve. But he trusted that when the time was right, it would emerge to fulfill its destiny. The Silver Creek Ranch Museum of Western Frontier Finance opened 2 years later, a striking modern building rising from the Montana landscape near the original windmill site. Within its walls, visitors could see the Union Treasury gold, displayed exactly as William had arranged it, alongside his journal and interactive exhibits explaining the complex financial history of the Civil War and its aftermath. The ranch itself thrived. The cattle operation modernized with sustainable practices that honored both tradition and innovation. The medical bills that had once threatened their future were long since paid, and a foundation established in William Miller's name provided scholarships for students studying history, agriculture, and ethics. Most evenings, Jack still found himself walking to the old windmill site, now carefully preserved with archaeological precision. Standing where his ancestor had once stood, he would watch the Montana sunset and reflect on the extraordinary chain of events that had connected them across time: a principled Union officer, a struggling Montana rancher, linked by blood and by a shared understanding that true wealth lay not in gold itself, but in what it could build for future generations. The windmill that had once pumped water for thirsty cattle now drew people from across the country to learn, to reflect, and to understand how the past flows into the present. And in that transformation from practical function to something more profound, Jack saw the perfect metaphor for his family's journey and for the treasure that had waited so patiently to fulfill its purpose. The Miller legacy, like the gold itself, had been forged in difficult times, preserved through faith and determination, and ultimately revealed when it was needed most, not just as financial salvation, but as a bridge between past and future, connecting a family to its history and to possibilities its founder could only have imagined. 5 years had passed since the discovery beneath the old windmill foundation. The Silver Creek Ranch Museum of Western Frontier Finance had evolved from a bold concept into a respected institution, drawing visitors from across the country to the once remote Montana property. What had begun as a desperate attempt to salvage scrap metal from a century-old structure had transformed not just the Miller family's fortunes, but their understanding of their place in American history. On a crisp October morning, Jack stood at the entrance of the museum's newest wing, a sleek, modern addition dedicated to frontier finance, building the American West. The grand opening ceremony was scheduled for noon, with representatives from the Smithsonian, the Federal Reserve Historical Society, and several prestigious universities expected to attend. "Everything's ready," Sarah said, joining him with a clipboard containing the day's detailed schedule. Her health had improved dramatically in the years since the discovery. The stress of financial catastrophe replaced by purposeful work managing the museum's educational programs. The multiple sclerosis remained a chronic concern, but with proper treatment and reduced stress, she had reclaimed her energy and vitality. Jack nodded, taking in the exhibition space with pride. Glass cases displayed Union currency alongside frontier scrip, showing the parallel financial systems that had operated during Western expansion. Interactive displays explained the complex economics of nation building, while personal artifacts, Diaries, letters, ledgers humanize the abstract concepts of frontier economics. William's journal is drawing the most interest from early visitors, Sarah continued. The conservators say it's one of the most comprehensive first-person accounts of Union financial operations they've ever encountered. Jack smiled at this. His great-great-grandfather's meticulous documentation had proven invaluable, not just for establishing the provenance of the gold, but for illuminating a little-understood aspect of American history. Historians had long known about the protection of Union Treasury assets during the war's tumultuous conclusion, but William's journal provided unprecedented detail about the decision-making process, the transportation methods, and the human drama behind the financial maneuvers. "Dad!" Emma called, hurrying toward them with the confident stride of a young woman who had found her calling. Now 22 and completing her master's degree in museum studies, she had become the family's most passionate advocate for the educational mission of their unexpected enterprise. The school buses from Bozeman just arrived. 60 fifth graders about to experience Civil War economics. Jack laughed. "Think they'll appreciate the nuances of wartime monetary policy?" "Probably not," Emma admitted. "But we've got the interactive treasure hunt ready. They'll learn without realizing they're learning." As Emma rushed off to greet the arriving students, Jack reflected on how the discovery had reshaped his children's futures. Emma had abandoned her plans for veterinary school, finding unexpected passion in the intersection of history, education, and museum management. Tyler, now completing his business degree, had focused his studies on the management of family enterprises and historical tourism skills directly applicable to the evolving Miller legacy. "Senator Blackwell just confirmed he's attending," Sarah noted, checking her phone messages. "That makes 3 representatives from the Montana delegation." The political interest in the museum had surprised Jack initially, but he had come to understand that the Miller discovery represented something beyond its historical significance. In a nation still wrestling with questions of federal versus local authority, their approach to the Union gold preserving its historical context while acknowledging its complicated status offered a template for handling other contested aspects of American history. "Mr. Miller," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Jack turned to find a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, approaching with an outstretched hand. "Walter Davidson, National Archives. I hope I'm not intruding before the official opening." Jack shook the offered hand, recognizing the name from correspondence about document preservation. "Not at all. We're just making final preparations. I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation with our research team," Davidson said. "The documentation preserved alongside the gold has proven invaluable for our understanding of Union financial operations." This had been the most unexpected outcome of their discovery, the way Williams' meticulous record-keeping had illuminated shadowy corners of American financial history. His journal and the accompanying documents had revealed previously unknown details about how the Union had managed its gold reserves, attempted to establish banking systems in frontier territories, and planned for various contingencies as the war concluded. "William would be pleased to know his records are contributing to historical understanding," Jack replied. He seemed to understand he was preserving more than just gold. Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. Our researchers have been cross-referencing Lieutenant Miller's records with other Treasury documents from the period. We believe this may not have been the only cache he was involved with." Jack felt a familiar surge of excitement, the same feeling he'd experienced when they first opened the hidden chamber. "What do you mean?" "Miller's journal mentions coordinating with other officers tasked with similar missions," Davidson explained. "We've identified at least 3 other individuals who may have transported and secured portions of the Union Treasury during the same period. The implication hung in the air between them. Other caches might still be waiting to be discovered, preserved in similar hidden chambers beneath ordinary structures across the western states." "I'd be happy to review any materials you found," Jack offered. William's approach was quite distinctive. If others used similar methods, there might be recognizable patterns. As Davidson departed with promises to share the research, Jack found himself drawn once again to the central exhibit, the display that housed a portion of the original gold cache, arranged exactly as they had found it beneath the Windmill foundation. The gold bars and coins gleamed beneath museum-quality lighting, but it was the accompanying text that Jack considered most important, a careful explanation of the moral and historical complexity of Union wealth, acknowledging both the technological achievement of the coinage and the complicated reality of how government finances were managed during the nation's most divisive conflict. This unflinching honesty had initially concerned some of the museum's advisors, who worried it might alienate visitors with strong feelings about American history. Instead, it had become one of the institution's most praised aspects, its willingness to present historical artifacts in their full context, neither glorifying nor condemning, but inviting visitors to engage with the complexities of the American past. "There you are," said a familiar voice as Miguel approached, dressed uncharacteristically in a suit and tie for the opening ceremony. The former ranch foreman had transitioned to facilities director for both the museum and the working portions of the ranch, his practical knowledge proving invaluable as they balanced historical preservation with agricultural operations. "Just doing a final walkthrough," Jack explained. "Everything ready on your end?" Miguel nodded. "Parking areas are marked. Security team is in position. And we've got the demonstration area set up for the traditional ranching exhibits." He paused, a hint of their old friendship breaking through the professional relationship. "Did you ever imagine this is where tearing down that old windmill would lead?" Jack shook his head, remembering the desperation of that day 5 years ago, the crushing debt, Sarah's medical bills, the imminent foreclosure. "I was just hoping for enough scrap metal to buy another week's feed for the cattle. And now look at us." Miguel gestured toward the expansive museum campus that had grown alongside the traditional ranch buildings, hosting senators and Smithsonian directors. The transformation had been extraordinary by any measure. The initial agreement with the government had allowed the Millers to retain ownership of enough gold to secure the ranch's financial future, while the majority of the artifacts were preserved for public benefit through the museum. The arrangement had evolved into a unique public-private partnership, with the Miller family maintaining control of the ranch and museum operations while collaborating with national institutions on research and educational programming. The working ranch continued, now showcasing sustainable cattle ranching practices alongside its historical exhibits. The herd had been rebuilt with premium stock, and the Miller brand had been repositioned as a heritage beef producer, commanding premium prices from restaurants and retailers eager to associate with the ranch's storied name. Most importantly, the discovery had allowed them to establish the William Miller Foundation, which provided scholarships for students studying American history, sustainable agriculture, and museum management. The foundation also funded research into other potential Union Treasury caches, working with property owners across the West to investigate historical structures using non-invasive archaeological techniques. As noon approached, visitors began gathering for the opening ceremony. Jack watched with pride as Tyler, home from graduate school for the event, confidently directed the setup of the outdoor presentation area. His son had inherited William's meticulous attention to detail, combined with a modern understanding of experience design and visitor engagement. "Mr. Miller," a museum staff member approached. "The governor's motorcade just arrived. Dr. Bennett is greeting him, but she suggested you might want to join them." Jack nodded and made his way to the main entrance where Dr. Rachel Bennett, now the museum's academic director, was welcoming the Montana governor and his entourage. Their relationship had evolved from cautious consultant and client to genuine friendship and professional collaboration, with Dr. Bennett overseeing the academic integrity of the museum's exhibits and publications. "Jack," she called, waving him over. "I was just telling the governor about our latest research project." The latest project had become Dr. Bennett's passion, a comprehensive study of how Union assets had been dispersed, hidden, and ultimately integrated into the post-war economy. Using Williams' records as a starting point, her team had traced financial flows that revealed unexpected connections between Union officers, Western development projects, and the emergence of Montana as an economic powerhouse in the late 19th century. "It's remarkable what you've built here," the governor said, shaking Jack's hand. "Not just preserving history, but making it relevant to contemporary audiences." As they walked toward the ceremony area, Jack reflected on this unexpected outcome of their discovery. When they had first found the gold, his primary concern had been saving the ranch, preserving his family's legacy in the most immediate, practical sense. He couldn't have imagined how that definition of legacy would expand and deepen over the years that followed. The ceremony itself unfolded with the polished efficiency that had become the museum's hallmark. Speeches acknowledged the unique collaboration between the Miller family, government institutions, and academic partners. A ribbon cutting officially opened the new wing, with Emma proudly leading the first group of visitors, the fifth graders from Bozeman, on their inaugural tour. As the formal program concluded and guests dispersed to explore the exhibits, Jack found himself drawn back to a small, easily overlooked display near the museum's entrance. Unlike the spectacular gold exhibits or the interactive technology stations, this simple glass case contained only a few personal items: William Miller's pocket watch, his cavalry spurs, and the simple fountain pen he had used to record his extraordinary journey in the journal that had validated their claims to the treasure. These humble objects spoke to Jack more powerfully than the gleaming gold bars. They represented a man who had lived through a nation's most traumatic division, who had carried an enormous responsibility through dangerous and uncertain times, and who had made choices that reverberated across generations, choices that had ultimately saved his great-grandson's legacy over 150 years later. "I thought I might find you here," Sarah said softly, joining him at the display case. "You always end up back at Williams' personal effects." Jack smiled, acknowledging the truth in her observation. "I keep wondering what he would think of all this, a museum built around his secret mission. Thousands of people learning about the financial history of Western expansion because of what he preserved." "I think he'd be proud," Sarah said. "Not just of the museum, but of how we've handled his legacy. He wasn't preserving that gold for personal gain. He could have used it himself if that was his goal. He was preserving it for something larger, something he couldn't fully envision, but trusted would eventually emerge." This had become Jack's conviction as well, that William had acted not just as a Union officer following orders, but as a guardian of history, somehow understanding that the artifacts he protected would someday serve a purpose beyond the immediate challenges of his era. The journal entries supported this interpretation, showing how Williams' thinking had evolved from protecting Union assets to preserving historical artifacts that belonged to future generations of Americans, regardless of sectional divisions. Later that evening, as the final visitors departed and staff began closing procedures, Jack made his way to the Windmill site, now preserved as an archaeological feature with a viewing platform allowing visitors to see where the discovery had occurred. In the gathering twilight, with the museum buildings illuminated behind him, he contemplated the chain of events that had connected him to William across the span of 150 years. A principled Union officer protecting Treasury assets through the tumultuous aftermath of Civil War. A desperate Montana rancher demolishing an old structure to salvage its material value. Two men separated by time, but united by blood and by the land they had fought to preserve. Each making decisions that would ripple far beyond their immediate circumstances. The old windmill had once drawn water from deep beneath the Montana soil, sustaining generations of Miller cattle. Its destruction had revealed a different kind of sustenance, not just the gold that had saved the ranch financially, but the history that had given the family a deeper understanding of their place in the American story. As darkness settled over the ranch, the stars emerging in the vast Montana sky, Jack thought about what they had really discovered beneath that weathered foundation. Not just Union gold, but a bridge across time, a connection between past and present that reminded him that no generation acts alone. Each leaves behind resources, knowledge, and values that shape the options available to those who follow. William Miller had preserved more than gold. He had preserved possibility, the opportunity for his descendants to make choices he couldn't have imagined, to build something he couldn't have envisioned, but that somehow honored the principles of preservation, responsibility, and stewardship that had guided his own actions in uncertain times. The Silver Creek Ranch continued its centuries-old purpose, raising cattle on the rolling Montana grasslands, but it had added new dimensions to that legacy: education, historical preservation, scholarship, and community engagement. The old and new stood side by side, neither diminishing the other, but creating something richer than either could be alone. Jack took one last look at the preserved Windmill site before turning toward the ranch house where his family waited. The foundation that had hidden William's secret for over a century now stood open to the world, its purpose fulfilled in ways its creator could never have fully imagined, but would surely have approved. The journey that had begun with a desperate demolition had led to construction of a museum, of educational programs, of a sustainable future for the ranch, and of a deeper understanding of how past and present continually shape each other. The windmill was gone, but the legacy it had protected continued to turn, drawing not water, but wisdom from the depths of American history, sustaining not just one family, but all who came to learn from what a Union officer had preserved and a struggling rancher had discovered beneath the Montana soil. As Jack walked back toward the lights of home, he carried with him the certainty that William had understood something essential, that true legacy isn't measured in gold, or land or buildings, but in the values, knowledge, and possibilities we preserve for generations we will never meet, trusting them to find purpose in what we leave behind when they need it most. 10 years after the discovery beneath the Windmill Foundation, the Silver Creek Ranch Legacy Project had expanded far beyond Jack's initial vision. What had begun as a desperate act of demolition on a failing ranch had rippled outward, touching lives and institutions across the nation. On a brilliant spring morning, Jack stood at the window of his office in the museum's administrative wing, watching visitors stream toward the newly completed National Center for Western Frontier Finance, a collaboration between the Miller Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Federal Reserve. The gleaming modern structure with its soaring glass atrium and careful integration into the Montana landscape represented the culmination of a decade of research, preservation, and educational development. It housed not only the original Miller discovery, but artifacts from 7 additional caches located through the collaborative research initiative Jack had helped establish with Walter Davidson and the National Archives. "The Secretary of the Treasury just arrived," Sarah said, entering with the composed efficiency that had made her the museum's most effective director during its formative years. Though she had officially stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on educational programming, major events still benefited from her organizational skills. "Emma's greeting him now." Jack nodded, adjusting his tie. At 56, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had faced financial ruin and emerged not just solvent, but purposeful. The lines around his eyes had deepened, his hair had acquired distinguished touches of silver, but his posture remained that of a working rancher, straight-backed and grounded. "Never imagined we'd be hosting cabinet secretaries when I was trying to salvage scrap metal from that old windmill," he remarked, a hint of wonder still coloring his voice even after a decade of extraordinary developments. Sarah squeezed his hand. "William would be proud not just of the museum, but of how the discovery has changed our understanding of that era." The historical implications of the multiple Union Treasury caches had indeed transformed academic understanding of the Civil War's financial dimensions. What historians had once viewed as haphazard security efforts during the war's tumultuous conclusion now appeared as a sophisticated contingency plan, a network of trusted officers tasked with preserving portions of the Union financial system against various potential outcomes. More surprising had been the documentation found alongside the gold in several caches, records revealing that, by early 1865, certain Treasury officials had begun planning not just for military victory, but for the economic integration of the country through strategic development of Western territories. These officials, operating with the blessing of Lincoln before his assassination, had created a distributed financial reserve that could potentially support national healing regardless of political developments. "Tyler just texted," Sarah said, checking her phone. "The governor's motorcade is 5 minutes out. He's bringing the congressional delegation with him." Jack took a deep breath, preparing for the day's ceremonies. The dedication of the new research center represented more than just an expansion of the Silver Creek Museum. It marked the formal establishment of a national resource for understanding a previously obscured aspect of American history. As they made their way to the reception area, Jack reflected on how their family story had become interwoven with a larger national narrative. The Miller discovery had spawned doctoral dissertations, academic conferences, television documentaries, and a best-selling book co-authored by Dr. Bennett and Jack himself, "Gold Under the Windmill: The Hidden Financial History of Western Expansion." But perhaps most meaningful had been the connections formed with other families whose ancestors had played similar roles to William Miller. The Davidson Research Initiative, named for the National Archives historian who had first identified the pattern, had located descendants of 7 other Union officers who had transported and secured portions of the Treasury during the tumultuous days following Lincoln's assassination. In Idaho, the Carlson family had discovered a cache beneath their ancestral barn. In Wyoming, the Hendersons had found Union gold hidden in a chamber beneath their family cemetery. A Colorado guest ranch owned by the descendants of a former Union naval officer had yielded Treasury documents and gold coins, concealed within the original stable's foundation. Each discovery had followed a similar pattern: careful concealment in structures built between 1865 and 1880, preservation across multiple generations of family ownership, and rediscovery during renovation or financial crisis. Together, they formed a complex mosaic of post-Civil War financial history that researchers were still piecing together. The reception area hummed with anticipation as distinguished guests arrived for the dedication ceremony. Academics in formal attire mingled with government officials, museum professionals, and representatives from the families whose discoveries had contributed to the center's collections. Jack moved through the crowd, greeting visitors with the easy charm of a man comfortable in dual roles, both working rancher and custodian of history. "Mr. Miller," called a voice from across the room. Jack turned to see Eleanor Carlson approaching with her teenage grandson in tow. The Idaho matriarch had become a close friend since the discovery of the Carlson cache 5 years earlier. Benjamin wanted to see the comparative display before the crowds arrive. Jack smiled at the young man who clutched a research notebook with scholarly intensity. At 16, Benjamin Carlson had already published a peer-reviewed article analyzing the metallurgical differences between Union gold minted in Philadelphia versus San Francisco research, made possible by access to samples from multiple caches. "The curators are doing final checks now," Jack told them. "I'll see if we can get you in for a preview." This was the aspect of the project that gave Jack the most satisfaction: watching young people engage with history not as a static set of facts, but as an ongoing investigation, a puzzle with pieces still being discovered and connections still being made. The William Miller Foundation Scholarship Program had already supported dozens of students, pursuing research related to Civil War finance, Western economic development, and the evolution of the American banking system. As Jack arranged for Benjamin's early access to the exhibit, he caught sight of his own grandson, 4-year-old William, named for his great-grandfather playing beneath a table in the children's education area. The boy was arranging replica gold coins in careful patterns, his small face set in concentration. The sight brought a lump to Jack's throat. 6 generations of Millers now connected to this land, to this legacy that had nearly been lost before its true dimensions were understood. Tyler and his wife Melissa had built their home on the ranch property, ensuring that young William would grow up immersed in both the working agricultural operation and the historical enterprise it had spawned. "Everyone's in position," Emma announced, appearing at Jack's side with the brisk efficiency that had made her the museum's associate director at just 32. Her academic credentials, a Ph.D. in public history from Montana State University, were complemented by practical experience managing the rapidly expanding institution. "We should head to the platform." The dedication ceremony took place in the center's soaring atrium, where 7 glass pillars, each containing artifacts from one of the discovered caches, surrounded a central display, housing the original Miller find. The architectural symbolism was deliberate, presenting the discoveries as connected parts of a single historical narrative rather than isolated treasures. As Jack took his place among the dignitaries on the platform, he surveyed the gathering with quiet pride. Representatives from each of the 7 families sat in the front row, a living connection to the Union officers who had carried out their secret missions across a wounded nation. Behind them, academics whose research had been transformed by these discoveries sat alongside government officials whose agencies had helped preserve and contextualize the artifacts. The Secretary of the Treasury spoke first, acknowledging the unique collaboration between private families, academic institutions, and government agencies that had made the center possible. What began as a single family's discovery has evolved into a national resource for understanding our complex financial history, he noted. The Miller model of preservation with purpose has become a template for how we approach similar historical finds. The governor followed, emphasizing the economic impact of historical tourism on the region and the educational benefits for Montana students. Representatives from the Smithsonian and the Federal Reserve highlighted the research potential of having multiple Union Treasury caches available for comparative study in a single location. When Jack's turn came to speak, he approached the podium with the straightforward dignity that had characterized his stewardship of the discovery from the beginning. 10 years ago, he began, our family faced the potential loss of a ranch that had sustained Millers for 5 generations. In a last desperate attempt to generate income, we began demolishing an old windmill that had stood on our property for over a century. He paused, letting the improbability of what followed hang in the air for a moment. What we discovered beneath that foundation transformed our understanding not just of our family's history, but of a critical chapter in American financial development. My great-great-grandfather, William Miller, had preserved not just gold, but knowledge documentation that illuminated decisions made during one of our nation's most challenging transitions. Jack gestured toward the family seated in the front row. We now know that William wasn't acting alone. He was part of a network of officers entrusted with preserving portions of the Union financial system during the chaotic period following Lincoln's assassination. Their actions, carried out amid the turmoil of a nation in mourning, reflected remarkable foresight, not about continuing conflict, but about ensuring economic recovery and national reconciliation. He continued, describing how the coordinated preservation of these financial assets represented a sophisticated contingency plan that transcended the political uncertainties of the time. The officers had been selected not just for their loyalty, but for their connections to regions where post-war development would be possible regardless of political developments. What these men preserved wasn't simply Union wealth, Jack emphasized. It was the possibility of economic rebuilding in a reunified nation. Their documentation shows that by early 1865, certain Treasury officials had begun planning not for continued division, but for national healing through strategic investment in our Western territories. This had been the most surprising revelation from the comparative study of the cache's evidence, that some Union officials had privately acknowledged the need for economic rather than punitive approaches to Reconstruction, and had begun preparing for infrastructure development that would bind the nation together through commerce and shared prosperity. The gold had been preserved not as a war chest, but as capital for building a more unified future. Today we dedicate this center not just to preserving artifacts, but to continuing the work of understanding. Each discovery has raised new questions about the financial dimensions of the Civil War and its aftermath. Each family story has added texture to our understanding of how individuals navigated the challenges of rebuilding a fractured nation. As Jack concluded his remarks, he felt a profound sense of completion, not of the historical work, which would continue for generations, but of the journey that had begun with that desperate demolition project. Silver Creek Ranch had been saved, but it had also been transformed into something William could never have imagined, yet would surely have approved, a place where past and present engaged in continuous dialogue. The ceremony concluded with the official opening of the Research Center's main exhibition hall, where visitors could explore the financial history of Western expansion through artifacts, documents, and interactive displays. The central feature, a life-sized recreation of William Miller's journey from Washington to Montana territory, allowed visitors to follow his route through a landscape transformed by war, experiencing the decisions and challenges he had faced at each stage. As the formal program transitioned to a reception, Jack found himself standing beside the original Windmill foundation, now preserved under climate-controlled glass as the literal and symbolic starting point of the center's historical narrative. Dr. Rachel Bennett joined him there, her academic precision balanced by genuine affection for the family whose discovery had transformed her career. "I've been thinking about contingency," she said, studying the foundation with its revealed chamber. How William and his colleagues created a distributed system to protect against multiple possible futures. They couldn't know exactly what was coming, but they prepared for various scenarios. Jack nodded, understanding the parallel she was drawing. Like demolishing a windmill to salvage scrap metal and discovering something that changes everything. William couldn't have known exactly how or when his cache would be found, but he preserved it for whatever future might need it. Exactly, Dr. Bennett agreed. These men were operating at the intersection of collapse and possibility. They preserved resources that could serve different purposes depending on how history unfolded. This perspective had become central to the educational approach of the Silver Creek Museum and the new Research Center, emphasizing how individuals throughout history had made decisions with incomplete information, preparing for futures they could only partially envision. It was a framework that resonated with contemporary visitors facing their own uncertainties about climate change, technological disruption, and political division. As the reception continued, Jack made his way to where Sarah was speaking with Tyler and Melissa, young William now asleep in his father's arms despite the surrounding activity. The sight of 4 generations of Millers gathered beside displays explaining William's journey created a visual connection across time that moved Jack deeply. "He's completely worn out," Melissa said, nodding toward her sleeping son. He insisted on explaining the difference between Union and Confederate gold coins to anyone who would listen. Jack laughed softly. "Starting young with the family business, I see." The family business had indeed evolved in ways no one could have predicted. The working ranch continued, now managed primarily by Tyler with sustainable practices that honored both tradition and innovation. The Museum and Research Center, guided by Emma's academic expertise, had developed into a nationally recognized educational institution. And the William Miller Foundation, chaired by Sarah, supported research and preservation efforts extending far beyond their own discovery. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a struggling ranch had blossomed into an enterprise that sustained the family financially while connecting them to a broader historical purpose. The gold that had remained hidden for over a century had emerged at precisely the moment when it could serve not just one family's needs, but a national conversation about how we understand our financial past. As evening approached and the guests gradually departed, Jack found himself drawn once again to the Windmill site, now an archaeological exhibit with interpretive signage explaining its significance. The Montana sunset painted the landscape in golden amber, a fitting backdrop for reflection on what they had discovered and what they had built. William Miller had carried Union gold across a healing nation, preserving it through the challenges of frontier development. He had hidden it beneath a structure built to sustain life on the frontier, trusting that future generations would find it when the time was right. And they had, at the precise moment when the Miller legacy stood on the brink of being lost, when the ranch that had sustained 5 generations faced foreclosure and dissolution. But the true legacy hadn't been the gold itself. It had been William's foresight in recognizing that resources preserved during one era might serve unforeseen purposes in another, that actions taken amid uncertainty could create possibilities for renewal generations later. He couldn't have known exactly how his cash would be discovered or what purpose it would ultimately serve, but he had trusted the future to find meaning in what he preserved. Standing in the glow of the setting sun, Jack realized that their decade-long journey had taught him something profound about the nature of legacy itself. It wasn't simply about passing wealth or property from one generation to the next. It was about preserving possibilities, creating resources, knowledge, and values that future generations could draw upon to meet challenges that the present couldn't fully anticipate. Silver Creek Ranch continued its centuries-old work, raising cattle on the rolling Montana grasslands. The Museum and Research Center welcomed visitors from around the world, illuminating a previously obscured chapter of American financial history. And young William, named for the man whose actions had made it all possible, was growing up immersed in both worlds, the practical realities of ranching and the intellectual excitement of historical discovery. The windmill that had once drawn water from deep beneath the Montana soil was gone, but the foundation that had hidden William's secret for over a century now stood revealed, a testament to one man's foresight and another's desperate gamble. Together, they had created something neither could have fully imagined, but that honored the legacy of both a place where past and future, practical and intellectual, personal and national, came together in dynamic conversation. As darkness settled over the land, Jack turned toward the lights of the ranch house where his family waited. The path forward was illuminated not just by electric lights, but by the knowledge that each generation builds upon the foundations laid by those who came before, sometimes discovering treasures hidden within those foundations that transform understanding of both past and future. The old windmill had served its purpose, drawing life-sustaining water from the depths. Its demolition, seemingly an act of desperation, had revealed a different kind of sustenance, connecting the Miller family not just to their own history, but to a national narrative about resilience, foresight, and the complex interweaving of personal and public legacy. As Jack walked toward home, he carried with him the certainty that William had understood something essential about legacy, that it isn't measured primarily in gold or land or buildings, but in the possibilities we preserve for generations we will never meet, trusting them to find purpose in what we leave behind when they need it most. The true treasure hadn't been Union gold hidden for over a century beneath a Montana windmill. It had been the vision to preserve resources during times of transition, the determination to search for solutions amid crisis, and the wisdom to recognize that what sustains us through difficult times may come from sources we never expected, preserved by ancestors who somehow trusted the future to make meaning from what they left behind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.